Todd Johnston, Vice President of Policy at ConservAmerica. Today we'll be looking at policies that promote natural solutions to climate change, specifically policies that promote and increase natural carbon sequestration opportunities and policies that facilitate voluntary and compliance carbon credit markets. Our panel includes some individuals who do a great deal of work in this area, including Congressman Bruce Westerman, representing the 4th District of Arkansas, Senator Mike Braun from Indiana, and Dave Tenny, President of the National Alliance of Forest Owners. Before I turn to our panel, I'd like to tell just a little bit about ConservAmerica. We're a center-right nonprofit organization focused on environment, energy, and conservation policy. We've been around for a number of years, and more recently we've made a renewed effort to influence national policy through educational briefings like this webinar, advocacy, and by increasing our media presence. For more information on ConservAmerica, see our website, conservamerica.org. Now we're going to turn to our panel. We'll allow each presenter a few minutes to speak, then we'll turn to some questions, at which point I would encourage each of the panelists to make this as conversational as possible. We're first going to turn to Dave Tenny, as our Congressman Westerman and the Senator are delayed. Dave is the founding president and CEO of the National Alliance of Forest Owners. His membership includes owners and managers of private working forests and 30 state and national associations representing tens of millions of acres of working forest. Dave previously served with the American Forest and Paper Association and at the Department of Agriculture. He got a start in the House of Representatives on the House Committee on Agriculture. Dave, I'll hand it to you.
Hey, Todd, I noticed that Senator Braun's with us as well. So I
missed that.
For the purpose of decorum and proper order, if you want to have Senator Braun start, I'm happy to defer.
Please, Senator Braun, we want to be respectful of your time. So I'll circle back. Senator Braun.
So we've got almost an entire hour scheduled, so that's a long stretch. So we've got it down to where we'll be in, I think, until close to 4:30. So it's a favorite topic of mine. So
got quite a bit to talk about.
I'll be glad to listen along and then interject whenever it's appropriate. But let me tell you a little bit about what's happened with our Senate Climate Caucus, and it's probably had more activity throughout the COVID basically shutdown here in DC through various technology modes, but we've not laid low because there was a lot of interest, a lot of momentum. We've got some bills out there that are working with bipartisan support. And I think it's clearer and clearer that we've got a significant subject line that more and more people are interested in. It's broadened where evangelicals from Indiana, farmers, to where they kind of poo-pooed the whole idea. They've been mostly great stewards of their ground anyway, but now when they know there's a way to maybe participate in that good stewardship with voluntary and compliance markets underlying the growing climate solutions bill, that even fires them up more. I was back home for 2 weeks, and there was a group out actually advertising that bill on some of the Sunday morning shows, which is great. So I think that the buy-in for something being done in a bipartisan way is stronger than what I imagined. I think the work that needs to be done mostly is the disconnect that most of party leadership in my conference has with the fact that they still view climate discussion as a step away from carbon pricing. And they don't even realize that many in industry, in trade, are interested maybe in that versus less regulation. Other side of the aisle starts to get a little disconnected when you talk about reducing regulations and replacing it with some other mechanism. But I cite it all the time. The only thing I've been more vocal on here since I've been a senator is the high cost of health care. And they are fighting anything to change their industry tooth and claw. And I think it'll be to their demise that I don't know that they have any friends out there. There's not a CEO that likes healthcare unless you're in the business of healthcare, because it's so dysfunctional. But they refuse to even embrace transparency bills and things we've been both interested in as well. The industry is pushing back. I've been very pleased by how proactive across the board the stakeholders are, even beyond agriculture, transportation, energy production, would be related industries of technology and finance. They want to be part of the solution. The healthcare industry is resisting every attempt at saving them from their own bad performance. So that's gratifying. It makes it a whole lot more worthwhile. I'm optimistic that we'll get more and more buy-in, but the biggest bang for our buck to get climate to resonate, and I'm guessing it's happening maybe a little more in the House. In the Senate, most of leadership, I think, is still bought into the industry's not interested in climate because they don't want any of the other stuff that would go along with it. And I think they're even wrong there. When I was able to get 6 senators fairly quickly to join the climate caucus, that meant there was a little pent-up demand. But I don't know that we go a lot deeper than that here in the Senate, where you're getting people on board.
Interesting. Well, I see that Congressman Westerman was able
Yeah, it's my first floor.
to join us. Congressman, are you ready to join the conversation?
You bet, Todd.
Okay, so we have Congressman Bruce Westerman next, who's serving his 3rd term as representative from the 4th District of Arkansas. He's on the Natural Resources and Transportation and Infrastructure Committees, and he's also on the Republican whip team. Before he came to Congress, he served in the Arkansas State House and is an engineer and forester by trade. So with that, I'll give you the Congressman Westerman.
Thank you, Todd. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
It's an honor to be part of this webinar and to be here with Senator Braun, who I found he and I have a kindred spirit. We had a hard time getting logged in, so we had a little bit of technical difficulties, and I didn't get all of his opening remarks. But he and I have worked on everything from healthcare to climate together, and I look forward to a lot more work with Senator Braun and others in the Senate as we tackle some of these important issues. When we talk about climate, I say that Republicans have to embrace the idea of our roots. And when you look at the word conservation, you can't have conservation without conservative. And it was conservatives that started the conservation movement in our country. Teddy Roosevelt, the father of conservation, Gifford Pinchot, who he was the first chief of the Forest Service. I have a special connection with Pinchot because he started the Yale School of Forestry, where I studied forestry. And as you look back at the great champions of conservation and taking care of our environment and being a good steward, most of them were Republicans and conservatives. So I'm on a mission to help put conservative back into conservation. And a great way to do that is with these natural climate solutions like the Trillion Trees Act. And I think because it's an idea that has been proposed first by Republicans, that there's been a negative pushback on it. And people say it's not enough. And I say, well, you tell me anything that's more proactive to help the environment than planting trees. I mean, we measure environmental quality by air quality and water quality. And trees are the linchpin between those two. Roosevelt said trees are the lungs of the earth because they breathe in carbon dioxide and give off oxygen. But they're also like the kidneys of the earth because they clean and purify water. So our two measures of environmental quality, air and water, are directly tied to the forest. That's why I'm so excited about the Trillion Trees Act. Senator Braun and I are working on, as well as others. And this idea that we can use a natural solution that has all these win-win scenarios to make the world a better place is something that's real important to me. And, you know, this idea kind of came from a research paper that came out of Sweden by another Yale forester that said that planting 1 trillion trees across the globe by 2050 would reduce 2/3 of the man-made carbon that's been put in the atmosphere since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the data is clear. I mean, if you look back at monitoring atmospheric carbon, we've seen a steady increase. Atmospheric carbon, you know, in modern times had not been above 300 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution. And we saw by the mid-1950s, it was at 315 parts per million, and now it's at somewhere north of 400 parts per million. So there's no question that there's more carbon in the atmosphere. There's no question that that's tied to man-made activities. But I think there's also no question that there's nothing more pragmatic that you can do to take that carbon out of the atmosphere than to plant trees. They are the natural carbon eater. And we can talk about not putting as much carbon in the atmosphere, but that carbon that's there is going to be there until something like a tree takes it out. And we've got even more opportunities with trees if we start doing sustainable buildings, and that's a big part of the Trillion Trees Act, is number one, plant more trees, grow more wood on the forests that we have and keep them healthy. And then number three is to use that wood in building materials. You know, there's a great story coming out of my home state of Arkansas where Walmart's building their new corporate headquarters out of mass timber. We're talking about 1.1 million cubic feet of wood that'll go into their corporate headquarters, which is, you know, it's housing 15,000 people. And 17 million tons of carbon will be stored in that building for as long as it's there. It's actually multiple buildings. But wood's also a great insulator, which reduces the amount of energy it takes to heat and cool and operate a building. So part of the Trillion Trees Act is a sustainable building tax credit, not just to incentivize the use of mass timber and other green products, but better efficiency in air conditioners, better insulation, better appliances, you know, all those things that make the long-term operation and maintenance of a building reduce the carbon footprint. So there's a lot of stuff. You know, be glad to answer any questions that folks have. I will tell you that they just called votes in the House, so I may have to leave for a minute, go vote, and come back over to the webinar.
Quite all right, we understand. All right, Dave, you're up. I've already given your intro, so why don't you go ahead and hit at it.
Okay, well, thanks for having me here. I want to start by giving my personal thanks to Senator Braun and to Congressman Westerman, both champions of forestry, both members of the House and the Senate Working Forest Caucuses, respectively. We greatly appreciate the work that they do every day for the 2.5 million people who depend upon our forests for their jobs. And for the tireless work that they're putting into this issue. We grow trees. That's what we do at NAFO. You'll see here that we're sort of ubiquitous. We operate in red and blue and purple places, and we grow a lot of trees, and our members operate at scale. And so when we think about climate change, we think of all of the things that we can bring to the table to bring natural solutions to our climate challenges. I want to share with you just a few things that I think would be helpful for you to see. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment because my computer isn't working right, and I'm going to share again. So just give me a moment here. Okay, when we think about anything that has to do with natural climate change, we don't forget that we are part of an interconnected and interdependent supply chain. What you see here is a supply chain that describes how we get trees into consumer products that we use every day. Wood, paper, building materials, tissues, toilet paper, which is very topical today, masks that are used in our hospitals and by other medical professionals. If you look at the supply chain, the first 6 of these boxes are in rural communities. We are a very rural supply chain. So when you're thinking about natural climate solutions from trees, you have to connect the trees and the products and the distribution to rural communities all over America. And like I said, 2.5 million jobs are supported by the private working force in our country. This is the most important slide I'm going to share with you today, because this describes how private lands support all the products that you and I use every day. We're going to focus our attention on the green parts of this slide. And we're going to share these slides with you. And I'm not going to go over everything on this slide, but just know that the more you look at this slide, the more you're going to learn. But here's where we're going to start. There are about 500 million acres of working forests in our country. Working forests are the forests that provide fiber and wood to our mills that help us produce all the products that we use every day. 70% of those working forests are on private land. If we look at the next circle here, we harvest, somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 million acres of forest land a year. It's a very small part of the total, but 90% of the products, 90% of the wood and the fiber that goes into our mills to produce products comes from private forests. Now, if you look at the products that we produce here on the right, 75% of all of the fiber and the wood that goes into our mills is used for building construction and for paper, packaging, and tissues. So 75% goes into these high-value products. There are other products that are produced, but keep in your mind the building construction and all the products that we use that come from our trees. We have a wonderful story to tell over the last 60 to 70 years. After World War II, our economy started to boom. There was a concern at that time about the impact of a growing middle class on trees. All the houses that we were building, all the products that we were consuming, what would be the impact on trees? Well, I'm happy to report that after the most extensive increase, the biggest increase in demand on our forests in the history of mankind, today we have 58% more volume growing in our forests in the United States than we did back in the 1950s. That's because our forests and the markets that support our forests are connected. And when those markets are strong, we grow more trees. It's supply and demand. It's pure and simple economics. Each year, we plant over 1 billion trees. It's somewhere between 1 and 1.5 billion trees a year, every year on our forest land in the United States. We grow trees to serve the markets that provide all these wonderful products to you and me and families all across America every day. We grow 43% more trees than we harvest each year. So we're actually producing more net volume of trees each year by 43% than we're harvesting, and that's good news for the climate. If you look at this chart for a moment, everything in brown is the accumulating carbon that's being stored in wood products over the past several years. We just thought we'd show you this snapshot. I'm gonna go back there again because I wanna hover on that. Everything in brown is the accumulating carbon that's going into wood construction. Everything in the green is the net carbon that's being sequestered in our forests. So in 2016, we were collecting and storing almost 1 billion metric tons of excess carbon. Now, what does that mean? That's about 15% of an offset of our industrial carbon emissions from fossil fuels each year. That offset is essentially being provided for free right now because we've become so proficient at collecting and storing carbon through the work that we do. Now, when it comes to policy, it's very simple. From the standpoint of a forest owner, we grow trees. Those trees are harvested. The harvested wood is more carbon that's stored in products. And then we replant those trees, and that's an ongoing cycle. When we think of a carbon policy, natural climate solution policy that has to do with forests, there's a simple equation we use. Markets plus trees plus wood equals mitigation at scale. And we need all three in order to make it work. We need what we call the 3 S's. We need the carbon that's sequestered in trees. We need the carbon that's stored in wood products. And we need the substitution that occurs when those products are substituted for other products that might be more carbon intensive. So if we're thinking about how to produce mitigation at scale through natural climate solutions, we look at all 3: sequestration, storage, and substitution. If we have a smart framework, we're going to have a framework for policy that enables participation at the broadest possible scale. We want landowners of all shapes and sizes to be able to participate. We want those who build and make things of all shapes and sizes to participate. We want those who develop projects to be able to participate. Participation is critical. We also want integrity. We want to be able to measure the carbon, and we want to be able to prove all of the claims that we make about the carbon that we are sequestering and storing for the benefit of the climate. We want to focus on outcomes. We don't need a whole bunch of rules that tell us to do this and to do that, and that constrict the ingenuity and the creativity that we can produce if we are given the opportunity to produce an outcome. If we focus on the outcomes we want to achieve, we're confident in the ingenuity of those who will help us get those outcomes. And then finally, investment. We want to attract investment. We don't have enough money in the federal Treasury to do this work without the help of the private sector. Those markets will induce private sector investment, and that investment is what's going to drive the outcomes that we seek. And who is investing today? This is just a snapshot. Congressman Westerman mentioned Walmart, but take a look at some of the others that are leading the charge. And this is all in anticipation of federal policy. Well, these are early adopters, and they're looking at natural climate solutions, and we're encouraging them. They are going to bring an incredible amount of capital to the table, and we should reward that and not penalize it when we think of policy going forward. Finally, we're not the only ones who think that natural climate solutions are important. The international community is on board as well. We are aligned when we think of natural climate solutions with the rest of the world. And we have an opportunity that's unprecedented before us, and we look forward to taking advantage of it, and we look forward to continuing our conversation today. So with that, Todd, I'll turn the time back over to you.
Information you provided there. I'm going to turn to Congressman Westerman since he may have to leave us for a vote. And thanks for your comments earlier. I know you've been doing a lot of work with the administration in connection with your bill. And there's also the broader UN Tree and Tree initiative. I was wondering if you could maybe speak to a little bit of how this fits into the broader international effort that Dave also mentioned just a second ago.
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm in a car now going over to the Capitol to vote.
There you go. I'm glad we got you.
There's a storm outside. So, you know, the part of the Trillion Trees Act that the way that fits into the global initiative is that if you look worldwide, the estimate is there's 3 trillion trees in the world today. At one point, scientists think there may have been as many as 6 trillion. So we're trying to get back up to that 4 trillion mark. And for all you tree nerds like me out there, there's about 300 billion trees in the United States. You know, our part would be to plant somewhere around 2 to 2.5 billion trees a year up until 2050. And we're already planting quite a few trees. So it's not as big a hurdle to overcome as you might think. And actually, the U.S. has done a great job in planting trees and leading in this effort for reforestation. But we've also got language in the Trillion Trees Act to help promote forest sustainability across the globe. And we need to be able to go into areas, and Israel is a great example of that, where they basically reclaimed desert by planting trees. We've seen that in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a great upside potential to what we can do by planting trees around the world and helping educate and give the technical expertise that's needed to get those trees planted.
I see the storm going on around you, so I hope you have a safe trip to your vote. Senator Braun, turning to your legislation quickly. Currently, there are voluntary compliance and voluntary markets and compliance markets supporting GHG sequestration. And I think that you might have even noted that those markets are growing very rapidly. I think that there's been an increase in activity in those over 200% in the last 2 or 3 years. I was curious how you expect your legislation to affect the volume of carbon credits in those markets. I note that we've seen compliance markets, particularly in Europe, that have gotten flooded and decreased the price and therefore decreased the incentive for folks to get involved. So I was wondering what you anticipate with respect to your legislation.
So first of all, this bill, of anything I've been involved with, has attracted more bipartisan support out of the gate, and it's because of its simplicity. And when you take agriculture, which is the only sector of the economy that has really been challenged leading up to where we are now, before COVID, it's really resonated. Agriculture is such a tough business, and just spoke to soybean and corn farmers earlier today that are looking at, on corn, maybe up to a $90 loss per acre. Last year it was close to $50 when you look at all costs in, including depreciation, which you have to in any business. So the current compliance and voluntary markets are maybe 15 to 20 bucks an acre. That's at least something to offset what right now is not sustainable for farmers. It'll end up being a situation similar to what we saw back in the early 80s, other than balance sheets are in a little cleaner shape than then. So in a nutshell, this is simply putting the ability for small farmers, ag farmers, and tree farmers to be able to go through the portal they're most familiar with, which would be the Farm Service Agency, through the USDA, to get their acreage certified and put into a position to where it is going to be market certified to be able to qualify for offsets. And this has probably only been available to larger landowners, and this is to democratize it to make sure that any farmer that practices good stewardship can now get value for it, and it doesn't cost anything. It doesn't require any tax incentives, any fiscal. That's the most challenging thing in the job I'm in here. Anything that does that is going to increasingly be struggling because of the poor financial shape that the federal government is in. So it just really is a well-crafted piece of legislation that addresses one component of the climate discussion, agriculture, and I think that it's got a good chance of making it through the process and hopefully becoming legislation.
Yes, to that point, what do you think that the prospects are this year? I know we've got a tight schedule going into the election.
Put things in perspective, almost any legislation takes a year or two, unless it's done for an emergency. We did move so quickly on COVID simply because it blindsided the economy and had to do something. When it comes to other major legislation, like the lands bill and national parks bill that just went through not too long ago, that was worked on for at least a few years. Here, we may have the chance of moving more quickly, but we need to get industry behind it, because the main resistance will probably be within my conference, to where senators are going to be afraid that this is just an incremental step towards carbon pricing, even though they need to be educated that many in the industry are not put off by carbon pricing. But there's just there's been so much hype built up about accepting the premises of what Bruce was talking about earlier, that we're putting CO2 into the air. And how often have you heard climate change and climate warming is a hoax? And I'm hopefully going to be one of several that start dismissing that false information. And I think this is the first kind of legislation, along with something practical like trillion trees, that gets across the finish line.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, helping farmers along by doing something that they're doing anyways, and allowing, companies that may need it for compliance to access those markets. So it's certainly a step in the right direction. On markets, Dave, I'm curious, we're talking about increasing the amount of trees that are planted and that are available for sale to put into products and other uses. Can you tell me how that is going to affect private landowners and their markets? And is that something stable markets is something that every business looks forward to and needs, and market saturation, kind of getting back to my point about carbon markets, is not something that folks typically look forward to. How are your members looking at this legislation that could increase the amount of trees that are in the United States and internationally exponentially?
Well, Todd, let me start by thanking Senator Braun. Leaning into this issue and showing the leadership that Senator, you're showing is critical. And we deeply appreciate your courage and your efforts to help your colleagues lean into this issue as well. So thank you for all that you're doing, and the legislation that you're championing now, the legislation that you're working on is going to be really important to that effort. Let me talk for just a moment about trees. Our members are in the business of growing trees, and I emphasize the word business. There is a market relationship between trees and products and the benefits that they provide. Now, we can think about the benefits of forest products more generally. They're the things that you and I use and need every day, including that beautiful mantelpiece behind you, Todd, that I'm sure is made out of some nice hardwood. That relationship is vital. What happens is, if you disrupt that market, say for instance you overproduce the trees without enough of a market to pull those trees, you might actually have an unintended consequence. If trees that are planted aren't done so in a careful way, they could actually disrupt and distort those markets in ways that would force landowners to have to think about other ways to use their land, because the value of their trees would go down. And so I think it's really important that as we're looking at the policies that have to do with tree planting, we look at them through the lens of that value chain that I described before, that's so delicately balanced and operates on such a thin margin. And so planting trees, where we plant them, what resources we use to incent the planting of those trees are all critical to that marketplace. And I think history has shown us that the marketplace has been one of the biggest drivers, the predominant driver of planting more trees, and should continue to be going forward in policy. And I think we can find that balance. I'm confident of that, but it's a balance that we need to provide.
Thanks, Dave. Turning back to Senator Braun, we've been focusing on trees a lot during this conversation, but the program that you're envisioning under the Department of Agriculture would provide technical assistance and verification services beyond trees. It would go to land and soil sequestration, reduce fuel use on farms, and even how we manage our livestock. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe to address the aspects of your bill that touch on the broader agriculture community beyond trees.
So it's interesting in that I'm a tree farmer, as well as have a farming entity. I don't drive the tractor, but I've been a landlord for farmers by investing in timber and farm ground over the years, and then do have a farming partner that I get involved significantly in all the major decisions. Don't do the day-to-day, but agriculture has row crops, soybeans and corn mostly. Sometimes wheat is in a rotation by itself or with soybeans. Hemp is actually something that is at the very early stages of developing here in the U.S. All of it, when you're using the ground and you're trying to keep the carbon in it, from the use of cover crops to the use of or trying to keep soil in place. Farmers have done, by and large, a pretty good job at it because it's in their own best interest to do so. I remember getting involved maybe 3.5, 4 decades ago and just observing farm practices and almost 100% tillage. Now, if there's any slope to ground, it's generally no-till. Farmers want to take care of the resource that their livelihood depends upon. So when it comes to the more difficult question of meat and poultry, that in time, I think, as world population grows, will work towards the meats that have the best feed conversion and that have the least impact on climate and putting CO2 into the air. So this is, aimed at the row crop side of it. When it comes to livestock and poultry, I think that is going to be something that comes into play as well. And the good news is we lead in most of those. We definitely produce meat a lot more efficiently, but we use a lot more of it. And that's the same dynamic when it comes to putting CO2 into the air. We still would have the highest consumption per capita by far on meats. We are now not the biggest carbon emitter. That would be China #1, India #2, because we've had a downward trajectory, and we still produce a lot of it, but have been paying attention to it. So it's a global question as well. Whatever we do here, the atmosphere circulates the globe, and sadly, China especially is putting up new coal-fired plants. I don't know how we get all that to work together, but hopefully the efforts we make here won't be offset by others that do not follow in like kind. So this bill is just fairly simple because farmers don't have any ability to invest a lot of money per acre because they're not cash flowing currently. Corn is the biggest of the 3 or 4 crops out there. And like I say, with current markets, they stand to lose 70, 80, 90 bucks an acre. So this will be a win-win in that it'll maybe encourage other farmers to change their farming practices that don't currently, because there'll be something measurable in return for doing it. But it is a broad discussion that whatever we do even here, hopefully it's setting the standard and getting other countries to follow suit, because even in agriculture, a lot of the agriculture CO2 emissions are here, but we're doing things marginally per acre that let us lead in terms of climate impact.
Yes, exactly. And you mentioned the international aspect, and that's been, part of the challenge, for, I guess, ever since climate change and what we do as a country has been debated for the past 20 or 30 years is what's happening in the developing world. So, and it's certainly still a part of the conversation as we try to decide what we do as a country. It's encouraging, though, to see that the support, the broad industry support you have behind the piece of legislation that you're working on. And earlier in your comments, you mentioned your part in the formulation of the Climate Solutions Caucus. I was just kind of wondering what kind of support or reaction was on the ground in Indiana to your participation in that. Conservatives are certainly coming along as it relates to climate change, and I think we've hit a turning point, and we're having a good dialogue with you and Congressman Westerman, and there are other great ideas about how to incentivize technologies and reduce emissions and get other nations of the world on board with that. But Indiana is still a very conservative state, so I'm kind of curious about what your constituency felt about that. I've
got a very vivid recollection of that, some of those first responses, like text, have you gone to the dark side? What's this climate caucus about? And that goes along with how heated the discussion is out here on any issues, and to where a part of our party still views it as a hoax. Just doesn't think that the simple statement Bruce made earlier, from 300 parts per million to 315 to I think it's around 400 now, all measurable. First of all, that doesn't make a difference. You can't see it. You get that ebb and flow of the weather. You just got a lot of misinformation there. And to me, the science is clear. And I think most of that kind of thinking would be folks that are not gaining sway, they're losing sway when it comes to the whole discussion. The number of young conservatives that weighed in, hallelujah, thank goodness you stepped forward to give us someone within our party that's going to be part of the discussion. So I was anywhere from kind of going off the deep end, from those that view it still as a hoax, but mostly, and I recall I was down at a political event, I can't remember where it was, shortly after I was the first Republican, and then I don't know if I had any others to join. I got 6 others fairly quickly, which goes to show there were several Republicans in the closet on climate, and they were glad someone did it. But I had more individuals that are check writers, to our conference and to the candidates that are running, that said, hey, thank goodness you did it. We're all behind you. It's an issue we need to be part of so that we can use innovation, technology, and not necessarily just government regulation to solve the problem. So it was well received in a place where people put money where their mouth is, and their mouth that day was on being happy. I didn't have one individual there say that, are you kind of going a little sideways on joining a climate caucus? They were for it. That was gratifying.
Yeah, I bet it was. That's good to hear. As I think about this debate, and much of it still focuses on the science, and a lot of that is rightly so. But one of the things that I am continually drawn back to is the fact that the EPA retains the authority to regulate, even under the Trump administration. And I've seen plenty of articles and heard folks that are working with the Biden campaign that make it fairly clear that they will reverse the policies that Trump reversed from Obama. And so we're going to find ourselves, maybe in a year or in 5 years in a situation where, EPA is again moving to regulate in a much more aggressive fashion than it currently is. And all this good work that you guys are doing, to find, emissions reductions in the agriculture and forestry section and to set up, markets so that credits and compliance opportunities are more readily available are going to be, well worth the time. People are going to be happy that they're there. So from my perspective, I think it makes complete sense that we're trying to figure out how to reduce emissions in the most cost-effective means possible. So thanks for your work on this very important issue. Dave, I want to switch back to you really quickly, and this is an issue that you brought to my attention about a week or so ago when we first started talking about this webinar, and that's the impact of the recent H-2B visa prohibitions. We're talking about planting a lot of trees in a very aggressive manner, and so I want to, and you brought this to my attention is something that would inhibit folks in your industry from kind of getting out there and taking advantage of the opportunities that things like the Trillion Trees Act might present for them, or even, frankly, kind of continuing to do the business that they are doing today. So I wanted to give you just an opportunity to address that issue.
Sure, thanks, Todd. We plant trees. We plant trees very well, and it's fundamental to our business. We've been very concerned about our ability to plant trees under a prohibition on H-2B workers. Here's how it works. Each year we put out our job postings to plant all the trees that we need to plant. Now let me give you a little bit of scope here. We're talking hundreds of millions of trees on millions of acres. That's the scope that we're talking about, up to that 1 to 1.5 billion trees that we mentioned earlier. Nearly all of the work that's done to plant those trees is done by H-2B workers after we've put out the ads for domestic workers. If we don't have those H-2B workers in the next year, we're looking at not planting upwards of 1.6 million acres of forest. That's about 1.1 billion trees. What happens to those seedlings? What happens to those trees? They just aren't planted and they die, and we don't aren't able to do the work. It's not simple. It's not as simple as saying that we'll just do more next year, that we'll plant twice as many trees next year. That's not how it works. When you're talking about tree planting at this scale, every season matters. And so we have we run the risk of foregoing an entire planting season, and think about the impact that will have on the uptake of carbon by foregoing the planting of 1 billion trees. That's a lot of carbon uptake. The cost of that to those who plant the trees, my members and others, we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars of cost. That's additional cost, foregone revenue cost, and other types of cost. Those are the estimates that we have today. I think experience will probably show that those numbers will go higher. So that's the risk that we have. If we want to keep the benefits of carbon sequestration in our forest, we have to keep the entire supply chain operating, and that supply chain depends in large part on the front end on these H-2B workers that come in and help us plant our trees.
Thanks, Dave. Senator Braun, you did a lot of work with the Department of Agriculture and pulling together your bill. And as you mentioned before, you have some personal history with the farming community. And I guess that, Dave, this could be a question for you as well. But I'm curious about the current U.S. Department of Agriculture conservation programs and how it encourages climate mitigation, and in the absence, say, for example, of a growing Climate Solutions Act, how useful and helpful are the current programs in place to helping us get at some of the reductions we're looking for?
I'll let Dave cover the tree side of it, and I'm familiar with that as well. But when it comes to the ag portion, you've got general things that are in place already. Of course, the agriculture bill is mostly about nutrition now, but the other two components would be whatever aid goes to farmers directly, that's mostly in the form of subsidized crop insurance. Up until recently, there have been some special things to help farmers get through this COVID crisis. But you've always had available through CRP, where you're setting aside marginal ground to where generally when that occurs, you've got some type of foliage on it that is capturing carbon. In many cases, you could be incentivized to plant trees, like in Indiana, for instance, roughly 20 million acres. And from when the pioneers arrived, maybe just 1 million acres were in glades or prairies up in the Northwest. So we went from 19 million acres down to just 1 million acres of timber ground, where subsistence farming was basically stripping the southern third of our state, along with then creating soil loss. It was, not only eliminating carbon sequestration, but then exposing the ground to terrible erosion. A lot of that was remedied through planting white pines through the CCC program back in the Depression. But more than anything, we got a plan called the Classified Wildlife and Forest Program in Indiana, which gives you a nearly zero property tax rate if you're a good steward of your ground on trees, and for some wildlife cover as well. But there have been a decent, that's not USDA, that's particular to the state, but USDA, Farm Service Agency, there's been funding, dry dams, grass waterways. You've heard of riparian filter strips. I've done all of them on various farms over the years. And as long as you can qualify, there's a cutoff for income level, which makes sense. Most farmers are able to participate. And that is there. This is just another tool that gives farmers a little extra income for what they're already doing, mostly to be good stewards of their ground. And for those that maybe haven't come along, believe me, this will pass through the farming community quickly, that there's a program out there that's a win-win. So it's not like the USDA and the Farm Service agencies haven't been attentive to it. It's just not been with a particular focus of climate as the main reason. It would have been soil retention and good conservation practices, and they go hand in hand.
Thanks, Senator. Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, the most important thing I can add is I noticed that Congressman Westerman is back with us, and
Yes, I saw that myself.
things that he would like to add either to this conversation or to maybe one of the previous questions. And so I will yield the balance of my time on this question to Congressman Westerman for anything that he would want to talk about.
Thanks, Dave. That's a real congressional move there to yield the balance of your time. I appreciate that. And I've enjoyed just in the storm here in front of the Capitol, hearing the dialogue and the conversation. A lot of great topics that have been covered, and a couple of things I wanted to hit on. And what Senator Braun was talking about, the opportunities we have with natural infrastructure and agriculture are huge. I'm thinking of a program that I'm working on in my state where we have a lot of row crop production, but we've also got a lot of poultry production. And a byproduct of poultry production is manure-laden wood shavings, and a lot of them. But these are very high in carbon, very high in nutrients, and we're working on a program to take those the manure from the poultry operations and haul it to the delta of Arkansas and use it on farmland, which it restores soil carbon, plus it reduces the amount of industrial fertilizer that's needed. Combine that with the surface water irrigation program that actually cleans water. And there's a tremendous amount of environmental opportunities out there in agriculture. And I think the sky's the limit on what we can do when we combine the vast forest and ag lands that we have here in the United States to not only meet the demands that we have, but also to be good stewards and leave what we have in better shape for the future. Just a couple of other things on trees. You know, when you talk about the working forest of our country that really provide all that fiber for paper and packaging and wood products, that's where you're seeing most of the trees planted now. But we've got a lot of land that's what we call natural regeneration, our national forest, a lot of federal land that is not used as heavily in fiber production. And the trees there produce the old-fashioned way. They have they pollinate and they drop seeds to the ground. And we can do so much more by creating or enhancing these forests that we have to make them more resilient and to get new growth so that we have healthy forests in the future. And that doesn't require somebody going out and taking a seedling and planting it in the ground. It takes a little bit of site preparation. You control burns and opening up the canopy so you can get sunlight to the floor. But we can naturally regenerate way more trees than we could ever plant. So the idea of 1 trillion trees across the globe with proper forestry management is something that's certainly doable. And we've also got great areas in the U.S. We got wetlands we can recover. Senator Braun was talking about all the land that was cleared in Indiana for agriculture. Well, we've got a lot of wetland areas that are begging for, you know, hardwood species and other trees to be planted there that provide wonderful habitat for things like mallard ducks that we like to chase after in the winter in Arkansas. So when you look at urban areas, there's a lot of places we could plant trees there. And a point I really want to drive home is we do a good job with forestry in the U.S. right now overall compared to the rest of the world. But the number one cause of deforestation is development. And you get development because some landowner says, my land is more valuable to build an apartment complex or to convert to something else than it is to grow timber. So the number one thing we can do to help forests in our country may sound counteractive or counterintuitive, but that's to have strong markets for wood products so that landowners say there's a value to me to keep this forest in timber. And I know that Dave and his group work hard towards that. And that's something we've got to do a better job of educating the general public on, is just how important markets are to keep forest land forested.
Thank you, Congressman. It looks like we're coming up on the hour. So if you gentlemen would like to give some closing comments, and certainly appreciative of your time and all of your efforts on these really important issues. But if you have something you'd like to leave us in departure, then please do so. Senator?
Well, thanks for taking the time. When it's a subject that you really enjoy, an hour seems to go by quickly. I think I've got a good partner over in the House, and Bruce. Dave represents our National Association well. Now more than any time, even though I've been a tree lover since I took the first Purdue short course back in the early 90s and appreciated how good an investment it is and know how I benefit from all the recreational and aesthetic values of it as well. It's a pleasure for me to weigh in. I remember back to the early days in high school of starting the ecology club, and never would imagine that it would play out in a way to where you can weigh in like this. You never know where life takes you, but I'm excited about how it also resonates with younger generations. And I think Bruce hit it on the head early. Conservation and conservative, they're nearly spelled the same. And the whole movement started, with Republicans. And I think we've got a lot of room to move. And I don't know if Bruce heard it when I said it earlier. It's mostly our leadership and party framework that would be the base of the party that needs to be educated the most to know how much of a winner the issue is. And I intend to keep articulating that through good legislation and every chance I get to do it on a public forum. So it's a pleasure to be in a forum like this as well.
Great. We appreciate all of your hard work. Congressman?
Again, Todd, I'll say thank you for having the forum and for letting me be a part of it. It's an honor to be here with my friend Senator Braun and Dave. And these issues are something that I think are fertile ground for conservatives to work on. And we talk about regulatory policy from the EPA. The difference between what I'm proposing in the Trillion Trees Act and the programs that I'm looking for out there are things that incentivize people to be good stewards. And I think if we can continue to be innovative and find those products and those programs that are naturally going to incentivize people to make good choices, it won't matter what the federal government does from a regulatory standpoint, that the markets will drive good conservation. And I look forward to staying engaged on that. When you look at the vast raw material supply that we have in wood in this country and the things you can make out of it, from nanoparticles to tall skyscrapers, the sky's really the limit on what we can do with wood. But then you start looking at the agriculture and the way that we can lower the cost of production at the same time that we're increasing water quality and we're increasing food supply. That is all a win-win situation. And those are the kinds of things that we've got to get behind and promote. And I will say on the House side, and I agree, we've got to do a better job of educating in our own party, but Kevin McCarthy is a co-sponsor on the Trillion Trees Act. And from the first thought about doing that, Kevin he would ask me every other week, where's my tree bill? That was him calling it his tree bill. And I said, well, I'm working on your tree bill. We're going to get it done soon. But he's bought into it. I was at the White House with Ivanka Trump filming a segment with Kevin about trees. So, people in the right places are understanding the importance of natural infrastructure, the role that forests play in that, and how really it's a winning proposition for our country. And it's something that our party has to, I believe, get behind. And like I said early on, we got to put conservative back into conservation. And with that, I will yield back and say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman. Dave?
Thank you, Todd. And thank you, Congressman. Thank you, Senator, for this time that we've had together. I will just underscore what we've heard our two leaders say. We have an opportunity here to engage rural America. Rural America is the heart and soul of everything that we're talking about here. If we want to engage rural forest owners, the folks that I spend every waking hour thinking and caring about, they need to get a very clear message that we care about their welfare. We care about their well-being. We care about their communities. We care about their economy. If we want to find solutions at scale, remember that it's going to take the carbon in the trees, but it's also going to take the markets that put carbon into products and store it there for a long period of time, and that substitute those products for other products that might be more carbon intensive. If we keep that in mind and keep going back to this rural concept, we can come out with a wonderful outcome that will not just help us improve the environment or improve our climate, but will strengthen rural America for the future. and that's a good conservative value as well. So I'll stop there, and again, thank you for the opportunity to participate today.
Thanks, Dave. And thanks everyone for participating. We are at the hour. In fact, we've exceeded it, but a very good conversation, and I hope it was informative from everybody that was out there watching today. So thank you, and look forward to seeing you soon.